There are few things while flying more terrifying than knowing you're going to crash. The horror of knowing you have maybe seconds to live runs through your brain as the plane gets lower and lower, watching helplessly out the window as the ground rushes closer. The only thing that would be worse is if the cabin suffered explosive depressurization and you get sucked out of the plane, thrown into an uncontrolled freefall with little to no chance of survival. And getting sucked halfway out of a window is exactly what happened to a passenger on Southwest Airlines Flight 1380. So, what happened? I'm Andrew, and this is History's a Disaster. Tonight, we're diving into Southwest Airlines Flight 1380, an accident that ended in the death of one passenger. And tonight's episode is brought to you by Bristly Goldfish Vacuum Cleaners. A vacuum cleaner so strong, it can suck a golf ball through a garden hose. With suction this strong, you won't settle for anything less. On April 17th, 2018, Southwest Airlines Flight 1380 was scheduled to fly from New York's LaGuardia Airport to Dallas Love Airfield in Dallas, Texas. It would be their second flight of the day. The plane was being flown by Captain Tammy Jo Schultz, a 56-year-old Navy veteran with 11,715 total flight hours, with over 10,000 of them in the Boeing 737. Captain Schultz was one of the Navy's first female fighter pilots, as well as one of the first female pilots to fly the F-18 Hornet. First Officer Darren Ellisor was a 44-year-old Air Force veteran with 9,508 flight hours, with just under 7,000 being on the Boeing 737. Also on the completely full flight were 144 passengers and 3 flight attendants, Rachel Fernheimer, Sneak Mallory, and Catherine Sandoval. The cabin crew had been with Southwest Airlines for 6.5, 4, and 2 years. The plane they are flying on is an 18-year-old Boeing 737-700 series, which had logged 62,521 hours of flying time and 37,000 takeoff and landing cycles, and was powered by 2 CFM International engines. The weather that day was looking good both in LaGuardia and also in Dallas, so not much expectations of running into any trouble. Just another typical flight. At 10:43, they took off from LaGuardia Airport and started to climb towards Dallas. 15 minutes into their flight, they got the clearance to climb up to their cruising altitude of 38,000 feet from air traffic control. But as the plane hit 32,000 feet, the shit hit the fan. A loud bang from one of the engines rang through the cabin, followed by the horrific sounds of metal on metal striking the outside of the pressurized cabin. The number 1 engine on the left side of the plane was breaking apart and throwing metal fragments into the air. The fragments were pounding against the fuselage as one struck a window and shattered both the inner and outer window pane, which caused the cabin to suffer massive depressurization, which we've all seen in some shitty action movie. The plane's cabin is kept at a higher level of air pressure at higher altitudes, where the air pressure outside is much lower. So when a hole is punched in the cabin, the pressure tries to equalize, which means the air and anything not strapped down gets sucked out the hole. The air is ripped from your lungs. Breathing becomes a struggle as the atmosphere thins out. The rapid change in pressure drops the temperature quickly, causing a gray mist to fill the cabin. Oxygen masks drop from the ceiling as both passengers and crew struggle to stay in their seats and put their mask on. In the cockpit, with an engine failure and rapid depressurization alarms starting to go off, the plane starts to shake badly enough the flight crew cannot make out the gauges. The engine failure causes the drag on the left wing to grow, and the wing starts to dip down, pulling the plane into a roll. The plane rolls just over 40 degrees before the pilots get the plane back under control and pull out of it. They knew there was a problem with the engine and assumed it was an engine fire based on what they believed was smoke in the cockpit. So They called air traffic control to get a flight vector to the nearest airport and start to bring the plane down. They needed to shed some altitude and bring the plane back under control, as well as to equalize the pressure and not need the oxygen mask to breathe. Several nearby smaller fields were rejected based on multiple factors like the possibility of the runway not being long enough for a 737, or the availability of fire and rescue equipment and personnel. So they settled on Philadelphia, 70 miles away. First Officer Ellisor, who was flying at the time, hands over control of the plane to Captain Schultz, which is normal in an emergency. The captain always takes control of the plane and starts going through the emergency checklist for a severe engine failure or fire, which means shutting down engine 1 before it could do any more damage. As they got closer to Philadelphia, they asked for an extended final approach so they could finish their checklist. And these checklists, while it sounds ridiculous that they're doing checklists in an emergency, they are important to make sure nothing is missed. With the shaking slowed down and the plane's altitude low enough they didn't need the oxygen mask anymore, the flight attendants were able to leave their jump seats and start checking on the passengers. When they hit row 14, they found the passenger in 14A had been pulled out the window. The seatbelt was the only thing preventing Jennifer Reardon from being pulled completely out. Flight attendants Rachel Fernheimer and Sneak Mallory tried unsuccessfully to pull her back in, yelling for help. Andrew Needham, a paramedic and firefighter flying home after a family vacation, jumped in to help, along with rancher Tim McGinty. They tried to pull her in, but the 300-mile-per-hour wind were keeping her pinned to the outside of the plane. They just couldn't get enough leverage to beat the pressure. After informing the pilots what was happening, First Officer Ellisor requested that the plane be slowed down. The decrease in speed eased up the wind speeds enough for them to get Jennifer back in the plane. She was unconscious and unresponsive, and Andrew Needham went straight into performing CPR. They're still 30 miles away from Philadelphia, and the pilots know they need to get on the ground as fast as possible with the passenger's life hanging in the balance. They chose to skip the longer approach and bring the plane in for a landing as quickly as possible, which meant skipping over or straight out admitting the remainder of the checklist. They called air traffic control in Philadelphia to inform them of their situation. At 20 miles out, their altitude is down to 3,000 feet, and Captain Schultz prepares to land, setting flaps to 5. The normal for a single-engine landing is flaps 15. At flaps 5, the plane is faster with less drag coming from the flaps. Captain Schultz was putting her fighter pilot experience to work, knowing the faster speed will give her more control over the plane. And since they were working outside of the box, they needed to quickly calculate the right airspeed needed for a flaps 5 landing. There was nothing in their checklist or manuals to help them out with figuring out the airspeed, since flaps 5 was a rather unorthodox approach. They were fast approaching the airport at 50 miles per hour faster than normal. It's a high-speed approach with only a single working engine, and there was a very real possibility they would not have enough runway to stop, with only one engine putting out reverse thrust to stop the plane. The passengers in the cabin had to brace for what could be a very hard landing. Flight attendant Rachel, unable to make it back to her jump seat, had to brace herself in the aisle with passenger assistance as the landing gear hit the runway. The landing went smoothly, and Captain Schultz was able to bring the plane to a stop at the waiting fire and rescue vehicles. Paramedics rushed onto the plane to take over from Andrew Needham, who never stopped giving chest compressions during the emergency. He just braced himself as best he could and kept rendering assistance. The paramedics tried to help and got her to the nearest hospital. However, it was too late. She died in the hospital from blunt force trauma to her head, neck, and upper body. Jennifer would be the first fatality on an American airline in over 9 years. 7 other passengers would also be treated for minor injuries. The NTSB quickly got to work with an investigation immediately into what happened. The number 1 engine looked like it had exploded, but there was no soot or marking to suggest a fire had started. What they did see was a missing fan blade. These fan blades are a critical part of the engine. They're responsible for pushing air into a turbine and powering the engine. The fan blade is also responsible for almost 90% of the thrust of the engine. They find evidence of a fatigue crack in the broken section of the fan blade. These fatigue cracks normally start out small and grow until it eventually breaks completely, if it's not caught early enough. Now, these fan blades are supposed to be checked regularly during routine maintenance. Any kind of damage to the blade showing, and it's supposed to get replaced. Same with showing any kind of fatigue. So the investigation digs into the maintenance logs to find out why a fan blade with a fatigue crack was allowed to fly. They found that all routine checks had been made, including a full overhaul of the engine in 2012. During the overhaul, a full inspection was done to all the fan blades, including number 13, which is the fan blade that broke. These inspections are done by hand using a special dye and lights. Any crack should glow under the light, making it clearly visible to the inspectors. All the fan blades passed the inspection at the overhaul, along with 7 more routine checks afterwards. So they dug in deeper to try to determine when the crack had started. To do this, they did a microscopic examination of the broken part and found markings called striations. A striation is formed every time the engine is started up and ran from the intense pressure put on the fan blade. So by counting the striations, with the help of a computer, obviously, they can determine when the crack started based on the number of times the engine had ran. They counted over 32,000 striations, meaning the plane had made over 32,000 flights since it started, which is roughly 6 years of flight, putting the crack at possibly happening before the engine went through an overhaul. So the crack had been missed during all of its visual inspections. They eventually determined the fault of the accident lay in the inspection process itself, since they were only using the dyes in visual inspections and the use of ultrasound, which was available at the time, to detect defects in the metal had not been a requirement yet. So now they know what happened to the fan blade, but not what exactly caused all the damage to the engine and the plane. Fan blades do, although very rarely, break. In a normal situation, it's contained within the engine and the plane lands normally. And that's when they found another problem with the engines: the latches on the underside of the engine cowling. These latches allow the cowling to be opened up so the mechanics can access and work on the engine. When the 11-pound fan blade broke off, it just happened to be at the perfect spot to be sent straight downward and slam into the cowling over the latches. The latches broke, and when the latches broke, the cowling started to open up and was ripped apart by the wind whipping over the wing. The wind shredded the cowling to pieces. The debris from the cowling flew up over the wing, ripping apart the leading edge of the wing and throwing metal fragments into the fuselage. And one of these pieces struck and broke both the inner and outer pane of glass at row 14, which had caused the explosive depressurization of the cabin. The NTSB recommended to Boeing that they redesign the engine cowling to prevent this from happening again. This had not been the first time this had happened. There had been a similar incident 20 months earlier on a different Boeing 737, also flown by Southwest Airlines. The NTSB also pushed for the FAA to require ultrasonic testing for the fan blades to better detect any defects. After the investigation, the plane was released by the NTSB and flown to a service facility in California for repairs. But for whatever reason, it was eventually moved to another storage facility where it was written off as a complete loss and never flown again. Following the accident, trust in Southwest took a hit and ticket sales took a sharp decline in the last half of 2018, creating a massive decline in revenue for the company. Southwest Airlines paid out $5,000 along with another $1,000 in travel vouchers to each passenger, which obviously wasn't enough for some people, since 10 passengers would later go on to file lawsuits against Southwest Airlines and Boeing, lawsuits that would be settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. Not among those suing was Mike Reardon, Jennifer's husband. he chose not to sue and kept his grief private along with his 2 young children. Later in 2018, the Jennifer Reardon Foundation was founded to honor her memory. The 43-year-old Jennifer was the Vice President of Community Relations for Wells Fargo, as well as a prominent member of the Albuquerque community where she lived. She had served on the boards of multiple nonprofit organizations and community projects. So, she was very community-minded and cared deeply about others. The foundation created in her name provided grants to several nonprofits in 2018 for money that was donated in her name also. The foundation continues her legacy of philanthropy to today. Okay, now, backing up just a little bit on these lawsuits, I would have understood, considering his loss, if Mike would have filed a lawsuit. But everyone else, this smells like an opportunistic cash grab. How can you say you're trying to hold someone accountable with these lawsuits when they had already came out and accepted responsibility? Southwest had complied with all safety standards and regulations at the time. Granted, those standards weren't enough, but they had complied. They weren't hiding some stupid shit where they were skipping out on maintenance or covering something up or any dumb shit. Although, yes, it's highly likely that if they would have included the ultrasound testing, the crack would have been caught much earlier and the whole thing could have been avoided. But they didn't do the test because it was not required of them. And as we know, most companies do not go above and beyond, especially if there's a chance that it's going to cost them a little bit more money. Also, having such an experienced flight crew did help to prevent any further loss of life. Now, going after Boeing does make a little more sense since it was their design flaw that caused the accident in the first place, and they would follow up with the proposed recommendations. In 2023, Boeing had completed the redesign process, but needed more time to complete changes to prevent cowl latch failures due to operator error. All airlines operating the next generation aircraft, that's the 700 series, are expected by the FAA to implement the new design change by July 31st, 2028. Captain Schultz and First Officer Elliser were commended by Congress for their actions in bringing the plane down safely. They, along with the flight attendants, Catherine Sandoval, Sanique Mallory, and Rachel Fernheimer, and passengers Tim McGinty, Andrew Needham, and Peggy Phillips, were invited to the White House for a ceremony in the Oval Office thanking them for their heroism. Now, Peggy Phillips, who I failed to bring up earlier, was a retired nurse on the flight who had jumped in to assist with performing CPR along with Andrew Needham. And that was Southwest Airlines Flight 1380. Thanks for listening, and if you liked the show, please consider leaving a rating or review on your app of choice. And you can reach out to the show at historiesanddisaster@gmail.com with questions, comments, or suggestions, as well as following the show on social media. You know, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, whatever. And share the episode. Your friends will love it. And as always, pet a penguin. Wear your damn seatbelt. Chase that dream. Live for today, because tomorrow is never guaranteed. Thanks and goodbye.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.